Thank you for having me here, Lauren, and thanks to all of you who are here for your participation. I don't recall the exact date, but I remember the place and the event that sparked my lifelong interest in criminal justice. St. Paul had his epiphany on the Damascus Road. I had mine on Tulip Avenue in Loma Linda. My parents, probably like many of yours, were supporters of the Faith for Today TV program. And in return for their financial donations, Pastor William A. Fagel would periodically send out small booklets, maybe a collection of sermons or biblical commentary related to recent events or a report of the program activities. But sometime in 1957, he sent out a booklet titled, "By God's Grace, Sam." I saw it on a small table in our living room. I started reading it, and soon I was hooked. The booklet told the story of a man named Sam W. Tannehill. Sam had a tough life. His parents separated when he was 5. He was passed from relative to relative and had lived in 12 different homes by the time he reached his teens. Not surprisingly, he became a troublemaker and then an active thief. And he spent the first half of his 20s serving 5 years in the Missouri State Pen on forgery charges. Back home in Fremont, Ohio, he had resumed his criminal career. He decided to rob a local restaurant called The Hut and then hit the road with his girlfriend. The Hut was open all night and employed just one person, a local woman named Shirley Bradford. In the early hours of May 2nd, 1955, Sam entered the restaurant, threatened Miss Bradford with his gun, and took all the money in the cash register. His plan was to drive her to a remote spot away from town and leave her so she couldn't call the police until she walked back to civilization, and he was long gone. But things went quickly awry. In the car, Mrs. Bradford called Sam by name and told him that she knew his sister well. He didn't know what to do. He realized his chances of getting away in the long run were nil. When they reached a secluded place, Sam ordered Miss Bradford out of the car. It's not clear exactly what happened next, but at his trial, he testified that she reached for his gun, which had slipped out of his pocket. Fearing for his life, he said, he picked up the jack from the floor of the car and hit her with it. Miss Bradford's badly mutilated body was found the next day. Sam was arrested in Kansas a few weeks later and brought back to Ohio, where he quickly confessed to the killing. Reading Sam's story fascinated me. I was 11. I'd lived all my life in Loma Linda. Everyone I knew was a Seventh-day Adventist. I had minimal experience of the world and none with crime. We'd only recently gotten a TV, and I'd never seen a police or a crime show. The story of Sam's misdeeds was unlike anything I had ever read. The details of his life and crimes were both thrilling and horrifying to me. I couldn't stop until I read all the way through. The climax of the story was predictable. The jurors didn't buy Sam's story of self-defense. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to death in the electric chair. But while he was awaiting execution, 2 local Adventist men visited him in prison and enrolled him in the Faith for Today Bible correspondence course. Though he had never set foot in a church, he was converted, and Elder Fagel became his pastor. After visiting him several times, Fagel was with him on November 26, 1956, when he was electrocuted at the Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus. The point of the book, of course, was to show the power of the gospel to change lives and how Faith for Today could be instrumental in that process. It did that quite well. But to me, the redemption storyline was already very familiar. What I took from that little book was something very different, something likely unintended, and something that changed my life. Though there was nothing in the book about the death penalty or any moral questions related to crime and punishment, I was deeply troubled by the ending. I understood why Sam had been convicted of murder. He was guilty. What I didn't understand was now that he had become a godly, Sabbath-keeping man, now that he had repented of his sins, why should he be kept in prison? Why should he be executed? And in a broader context, I'm still wondering that. My disquiet led to an abiding interest in criminal justice. In the early 1980s, I spent 2 years in Louisiana as a volunteer with the Mennonite Central Committee, working on issues related to prison conditions and the death penalty. In 1995, I went to law school and then became a public defender in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. I'd like to start with some hard realities. Crime, especially violent crime, is a serious problem in our country. The damage it does is immense to individual lives, to families, to communities. It tears the fabric of our society and destroys the general goodwill that helps it to function smoothly. It wakes primitive fears and feelings in us, particularly when we're faced with something like another mass shooting or some vicious, seemingly random murder of innocents. When we learn about such crimes, we want the people who have done them to be caught and stopped and punished. Those are normal, basic human emotions we all share. But from that point on, things get morally muddy. We can also be inclined to think of the perpetrators of such deeds as somehow different from us, as alien, maybe as not quite human. And in the current climate, we seem to have just one answer to the problem of violent crime: lock them up. Consider some numbers that should make us all uneasy. Lauren, if you can put up the first slide. America leads the world in many things, but we truly excel in caging human beings. With less than 5% of the world's population, we have more than 21% of its prison population. We have the fifth highest we have the fifth highest incarceration rate of any major nation, trailing only such places as El Salvador, Cuba, and Turkmenistan. And if you want to show the next slide, you can see that we rank here fifth compared to other somewhat similar nations, Australia, China. You can see that our rate of incarceration, this is per 100,000 population, is about 3 times higher than Australia, 4.5 times higher than China, 6 times higher than Canada, 10 times higher than Norway, and 16 times higher than Japan. Right now, there are more adult Black men under court or penal supervision than were slaves in America in 1850. The raw numbers are staggering. If you want to show the next slide, Lauren. The number of state and federal prisoners awaiting sentencing is over 1 million. You can see the population, state prison more than 1 million, local jails 550,000, federal facilities 208,000. The majority of those in jails are waiting disposition, but most of those in state prison, 80%, are serving sentences. And to this number, 1.935 million, if you add those on probation and parole, it comes to 5.96 million, just about 6 million of our fellow citizens. These numbers might make sense if we had the world's highest crime rate, but we don't. We're neither great nor terrible in that regard. If you have the next slide, currently, with a homicide rate, the U.S. is 67th of 193 countries, and the violent crime rate is 59 of 147 countries. And since the early 1990s, the rate of reported violent crime has dropped significantly. If you show the next slide, Lauren, you can see that in 1990, 729 reported crimes per 100,000 population. That number dropped steadily over the last, 34 years, until today, it's almost exactly half of what it was in 1990. There were some spikes during the peak COVID years, which have now mostly subsided. And in the last 2 years, there's been a significant drop in the murder rate. But this reduction has had only a small impact on incarceration rates. For some perspective, it's important to note that these huge numbers are a relatively recent phenomenon. If you want to show the next slide, Lauren, in 1972, there were about 200,000 inmates in our state and federal prisons. But you can see how those numbers have risen in the past just over 40 years. More than 300% rise in prison, jail, probation numbers, and 500% in those on parole, leading again to the total right now of those under incarcerated or under supervision, about 6 million. Not surprisingly, our lock 'em up policies come at a huge price. An estimated $84 billion a year in direct costs, and another 100 billion per year in such things as court costs, policing, family support for inmates. A grand total of $184 billion. This cost is so great that a growing number of policymakers of all political stripes have agreed that we have to do something. A variety of modest penal reforms have gained significant support, including early release for inmates convicted of nonviolent drug offenses, more and better treatment for drug addiction and mental health issues, and options to incarceration for juvenile offenders. These are all good ideas, but they're only picking the low-hanging fruit. Despite what many reformers would say or hope, these proposals just nibble at the edges of the problem. The hard reality is that state facilities hold nearly 90% of U.S. prisoners, and more than half of them are locked up for violent crimes. Overall, we can't make substantive, lasting changes in our system simply by modifying our treatment of nonviolent crimes or criminal offenses, or drug offenses. We have to deal with violent crime. And right now, we're moving in the wrong direction. We're not just locking up lots of people, we're doing it for longer times. In 1984, there were 34,000 people in state and federal prison living life. I'm going to show the next slide, Lauren. You can see that now that number is up by 6 times to about 200,000. And that represents 56,000 doing life without parole, and another 147,000 serving life without parole or 50 plus years, a virtual life sentence. Before 1970, only 7 states had life without parole. Now every state but Alaska has that sentence. In practical terms, a life sentence in the feds used to mean 15 years. Now it's often life without parole. And most states have made similar shifts, harsher sentences. And it's interesting to compare those numbers with other nations where a life sentence is possible. England, with a population 1/5 of ours, has 65 inmates serving life without parole. And France, Germany, and the Scandinavian countries have all banned life without parole sentences. A variety of causes has contributed to this explosion in the average lengths of sentences. Things like mandatory minimums, which guarantee significant prison time, three strikes laws, where people can end up doing life for relatively minor crimes, heavy penalties for certain crimes, and the growth of private prisons, which provide an economic incentive for incarceration. Together, these policies illustrate a major shift in emphasis for our entire penal system. In the last 30 years or so, we have abandoned nearly all rehabilitation efforts to focus on incapacitation and punishment. We now assume, with good reason, that most people who are locked up for violent crimes will never come out. As things stand, our prisons and jails barely pretend to educate or nurture or train the people who are confined there. With few exceptions, they are grim, dirty, violent places intended to restrain and punish the inmates. Their hallmark is an almost complete disregard for the value and the possibilities of human beings. They exemplify a terrible giving up on violent offenders as people of any worth, people with any potential. There's us on the outside and them inside. I cannot think of any system more opposed to the gospel of Jesus, opposed to a belief that every person is of infinite value, which leads directly to some complex and challenging questions. When it comes to dealing with crime and criminals, is there a specifically Christian response? If so, what should it be? How are we called to live in this age of mass incarceration? What does love require? Before looking directly at that question, I'd like to move from numbers to real life and put a human face on these big numbers of incarcerated people. I'd like to tell you about three people who were caught up together in the criminal legal system, who they were, what they did, and how their case was decided. And this slide, Laura, will come up at the end of this part. Sometime in the early hours of August 18, 2009, a man named Shahab Rana was murdered in the small Pizza Mart convenience store that he owned in Northeast Washington. When his brother Ollie came to work around noon, he couldn't get inside. Police forced their way into the store later that afternoon and found Shahab lying dead in a pool of blood. The last receipt showed that he had been alive at 1:30 a.m. Shahab was Pakistani by birth and a legal U.S. resident. He was well known in the neighborhood, but not widely loved. Like many immigrants, he was a hardworking, no-nonsense guy focused on making money and sending it back to his family. A year earlier, he had pled guilty to simple assault for trying to run over a homeless man who was urinating against the side of his store. It was an unusually brutal killing. The autopsy showed that he had been stabbed 12 times, hit repeatedly in the head with a blunt object. His throat had been cut and his body was severely burned. Cigarettes, cigars, and about $2,000 in cash had been taken from the store. And based on the missing items and money, police first surmised the crime was a robbery gone bad. It would turn out to be far more complicated than they had imagined. 10 days after the murder, detectives arrested 27-year-old Shanika Robinson. 4 weeks later, they arrested two men, Shanika's 25-year-old brother, Leon Robinson, and her sometime boyfriend, 26-year-old Ike Genus. All three were charged with first-degree premeditated murder. What happened with this case in the following months and years is a good illustration of how our criminal justice system currently operates. So for the next few minutes, I'd like each of you to imagine that you are the judge assigned to this case, that your job is to decide the appropriate sentence if anyone is convicted. But first, full disclosure, Shanika Robinson was my client. And over a 3-year period, I spent many, many hours with her, and I cared deeply about her fate. In talking about the case, I'll do my best to be factual, but I am not now, nor was I ever, a neutral, disinterested party. Shahab's younger brother, Ali, had come to the U.S. in 2006 as a visitor. He overstayed his visa and violated its terms by working. But Shahab badly needed his help at the store. So in October 2008, Shahab arranged a sham marriage for his brother with Shanika, whom he knew from the neighborhood. It was a way for Ali to get a resident visa and stay legally. Shanika had initially resisted the idea, but she was desperate for money. After Shahab agreed to pay her $500 a week and that this union would have no sexual component, the two got married. But the arrangement quickly ran into trouble. Ali fell in love with his wife and wanted a real marriage. Shanika had no such feeling, seeing other men. In July of 2009, they had an interview with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement that went badly. It seemed likely that Ali's visa application would be denied. Ali told his brother he wanted a divorce, and Shahab stopped the payments to Shanika. She pressed for a resumption, which led to a violent confrontation, and Shahab ended up dead. Within days of his arrest, Ike pled guilty to murder too. He agreed to cooperate with the police and testify against the other two in exchange for leniency. Shanika wanted to plead guilty as well. Even though she denied any part of the killing, she told the judge that everything had happened because of her involvement with the brothers. She felt responsible. The government offered her a plea to murder too. But the deal was wired, meaning her brother Leon would have to plead guilty as well. He would not, or she would have to testify against him. She would not. And so in the late summer of 2011, their cases went to trial. At the trial as a prosecution witness, Ike gave this account of the crime. After the money stopped, Shanika made a plan to get even by robbing Shahab with help from him and Leon. At the pizza march, Shanika persuaded Shahab to open the locked door. And as soon as they were inside, Leon began stabbing Shahab. Then he picked up a hammer and hit Shahab in the head. Ike said he punched and kicked Shahab, then picked up the knife and cut his throat. He said Shanika helped them set the fire to his body, and afterwards they took money and other items from the store. Shanika testified in her own defense. She described her financial woes, how she'd lost her job, how she was trying to pay rent and support her sister, who was dying of AIDS, and she was caring for her sister's 2 small children. She admitted to the fake marriage, but she said that after Shahab stopped the payment, she couldn't apply for work because he had her legal papers and wouldn't give them back because she was sleeping around. She said she planned to talk to Shahab by herself, but Ike and Leon wanted to go with her. She didn't know they had any weapons. At the pizza mart, she tried to talk to Shahab, but he quickly got into an argument with Leon and Ike. And when the men all started yelling, she got upset and walked back to the car. She waited there until Ike and Leon came back. When she saw blood on the men and Ike gave her $500, she said she kind of knew what had happened, but didn't want to ask. She learned the truth when her sister called to say Shahab was dead. Leon also testified and denied any involvement in the whole matter. It's not clear exactly what the jurors believed. I didn't speak with any of them afterwards, but based on their verdict, reached after 2 days of deliberations, it seems that they credited much of Ike's story, but also significant parts of Shanika's story. They convicted Leon Robinson on all charges, including first-degree premeditated murder, armed burglary, and armed robbery. Shanika was acquitted of premeditated murder, but convicted for felony murder. which is a killing during the course of a robbery. The jurors also found an aggravating factor, that the killing was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. So after the trial, here's where things stood. Shanika, the one behind everything that happened, may or may not have had a direct role in the robbery and killing. She was convicted of felony murder and related charges. Leon, the one the jury believed had led the attack and stabbed Shahab repeatedly, hit him with a hammer, and helped set him on fire, was convicted of all charges. Ike, the one who admitted that he stabbed Shahab and cut his throat and helped set him on fire and stole money, pled guilty to second-degree murder. Finally, just some quick background for the sentencing hearing. Leon had had a difficult child with an abusive father. At 17, he shot a young man who had hit his mother in the face with a metal pole. He testified he thought the man was about to hit his sister with it as well. The government agreed the man had attacked his mother, but said she was running. The man had attacked his mother, but said he was running away when Leon shot him. Leon was convicted of assault with intent to kill and served 6 years. People who knew him said he was a quiet, sweet kid before prison, but an angry, bitter young man after. Shanika had been sexually abused by her father from about age 8 to 12. She kept reporting it and was finally taken seriously. Her father pled guilty and went to prison, but her mother blamed her for breaking up the family. When I got to know her better, she told me that he would regularly slip into her room at night, calling her name softly, and do his terrible deeds. Because of that, she hated hearing her own name and asked me to call her by a nickname. Shahab had been a father figure to her, but she felt betrayed by him as her own father had done. She had no prior criminal record. As for Ike, he had an unremarkable personal history. 3 prior misdemeanor convictions, 2 related to drugs, but nothing violent. So if you were the judge, what punishment would you impose? Start with Leon. What sentence do you think is appropriate for his crimes, for the protection of society? How many years in prison does he deserve? Well, as you can see from the slide, what happened. He got 76 years. What about Shanika? She got 54 years. And what about Ike? He got 20 years. A couple of things worth noting here. The judge in this case was harsh, but the sentences were within the guidelines. Other judges probably would have done something less. And for Ike, there was a huge benefit, not because he was less violent or less culpable, but because he was willing to be a cooperator or a snitch, depending on your viewpoint. But you can see their release dates here. Leon is scheduled for release in 2077 when he'll be 92. It's highly unlikely he'll live that long. Shanika was initially set for release in 2055. But her convictions were reversed on appeal. If you're interested, I could explain later. But she then pled guilty to second-degree murder and resentenced by another judge to 28 years. Her release date is now 2032 when she'll be 49. From experience, I can tell you that what happened in this particular case is fairly typical of what happens in murder cases and with other serious crimes. Is that how things should be? I'm sure by now that you have a pretty good idea of my general thoughts on this subject. But let me be perfectly clear. I believe that for us who claim Jesus as Lord, Concern for people in prison is not simply a social or a political priority, but a spiritual priority. And that those who wish to truly follow him will see prisoners and their circumstances and even their sentences in a different way. In his first public statement recorded in Luke 4, Jesus said part of his mission was to proclaim freedom for prisoners. And in one of the most straightforward, provocative passages of Scripture, the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, Jesus describes how those who will be welcomed into heaven relate to the people around them, and more specifically, how they treat the poor and dispossessed, and yes, the prisoners among us. You can see here, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." What Jesus says here with simple clarity is that the distinguishing characteristic of those bound for the kingdom is not their adherence to the 28 fundamental beliefs, not their regular church attendance or prayers, not their tithes and offerings, but whether they cared for the poor and needy and took in strangers and visited prisoners. Why is this so? Because Jesus identifies himself with these people. Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. There is something profound here that is easy to miss. Jesus doesn't say, "One of my followers was in prison and you visited him," or one of your countrymen was in prison. He says what? I was in prison. I was in prison. That's where I am. When we meet prisoners, when we engage with them, we are not just doing the work of Jesus, we are meeting him face to face. Thomas Merton put it eloquently in his Raids on the Unspeakable. Into this world, this demented inn, in which there is absolutely no room for him at all, Christ has come uninvited. But because he cannot be at home in it, because he is out of place in it, his place is with those others for whom there is no room. Those who do not belong, those who are discredited, who are denied the status of persons. With those for whom there is no room, Christ is present in the world. It is in these that he hides himself, for whom there is no room. And it's interesting that Jesus says, "You visited me." That's not so difficult, visiting. But what typically happens? If you visit someone, you'll start getting to know them, to understand them, and likely to begin caring about them. And who knows where that might lead? Jesus' story makes it clear why we need a new way of seeing. The goats in the parable, the folks who are cursed, what do they say? "Lord, we didn't see you." Implicit in their questioning is that we're good, caring, church-going people. If we'd seen you, if we'd known you were in prison, we would have cared about you. We would have visited you and helped you, but we didn't see you. They were expecting a comfortable, safe, familiar Jesus, not one who identified with people that were hurting and scary and different. Their sin was blindness to the living presence of Jesus among us, in the poor and the prisoner. And their awful fate, depart from me. You never really knew me. If you had, you would have seen me and cared for me. As followers of Jesus, we are called to see prisoners, to see criminals, not as them, not as dangerous others, and not even as mere fellow citizens. We are called to see them as brothers and sisters, as the embodiment of Christ's presence on earth. And with that eyesight and that understanding, we cannot be indifferent to their treatment, their fate, or their possibilities. We cannot wash our hands of them or just say, you do the crime, you do the time. We must embrace them, not as our ticket to heaven, but as a blessed chance to personally encounter our Lord. It goes without saying that that's a hard thing to do, a very hard thing. It seems contrary to normal human feelings, and it is most certainly contrary to prevailing attitudes in this nation. We have to somehow separate fear and aversion we may have for certain crimes from our feelings toward the people who may have committed them. And the only way to do that is to see them as God sees them and to extend to them the same grace we have ourselves received. That way of seeing will inevitably lead to a new way of being. We're living in a time of deep divides in our nation and our world. We're often bitterly at odds with our neighbors based on politics, religion, color, ethnicity, sexuality, you name it. People unlike us are not merely wrong, they're evil. And in the face of such divisions, it is easy to despair. Now more than ever, we need Christians who see that we're all equal in God's sight, that we are all just sinners saved by grace. More than ever, we need Christians who insist on unconditionally caring for others, on sharing their resources with anyone in need, and rejoicing that we live in a time when freely offered love is so sorely needed. For the rest of my time, I want to talk about two specific proposals that could significantly reduce the levels of incarceration in our country. They're not original with me, and as far as I know, they did not originate from any biblical theology of crime and punishment. Rather, they're practical ideas that have been studied and implemented in other places, particularly in Scandinavia. But for what it's worth, to a significant degree, I think they reflect Christian principles about the ability of human beings to grow and change, to be redeemed. Their starting premise is simple. We've gotten where we are by locking more people up for longer times. If we want things to change, we must lock fewer people up and for less time. Both concepts involve a fundamental rethinking of how we punish criminals. The first proposal, as you can see here, is to cap all sentences for violent crimes at 20 years. 20 is certainly an arbitrary number, but a logical one. Some proponents suggest a bit less, others more. But this cap would come with an exception. In any particular case, a review panel could decide that if the person presents a continuing danger to the community, the sentence can be extended for 5 more years. And there would be no limit to the number of extensions. But the burden would always be on the state to prove dangerousness, not on an individual to prove harmlessness. Second proposal is to establish sentence review panels to look at the cases of those currently in prison. There would be a required review after a person had served 10 years and every 2 years thereafter. At any point before the end of the person's sentence, he or she could be released if the person were deemed to be ready to return to the community. So, cap new sentences at 20 years and review all existing sentences after 10 years. It's fair to say, I think, that if these proposals were put to a vote with the general population today, they would have very minimal support. They run contrary to almost universal public opinion, and few people are publicly advocating for them or highlighting the potential benefits. But let's look at them a little closer and the key arguments pro and con. First, there are two main arguments, I think, against these proposals or similar ones. First is safety. The driving force behind our present policies, which have led us to this state of mass incarceration, is concern for public safety. What would happen if we capped sentences at 20 years for all violent crimes and offered the possibility of early release for those currently in prison for such offenses? Well, many people believe that despite some flaws, our criminal legal system is working pretty well. They contend that the main reason crime has dropped over the last 20 years is that so many criminals are now locked up. Incapacitation may not be pretty or popular in other countries, but it's effective. If we start letting inmates out of prison early, putting them there for shorter times, crime will go right back up. Violent criminals are dangerous people and they need to be treated as such. The high cost of mass incarceration is money well spent. And just because we aren't in sync with Norway or Denmark or some other country doesn't mean we're wrong. That's a powerful and appealing argument. Who doesn't want to be safe or to do whatever they can to keep their families and loved ones safe? The second main argument is a moral one. For many people, sentencing a person to only 20 years in prison for, let's say, a brutal murder or 2 or 3 doesn't seem like enough time. It doesn't seem to be commensurate with the crime. The punishments we typically impose may be harsh, like the ones that were given to Leon Robinson or Shanika Robinson. But in most cases, they're appropriate and fair. You can't brush this view off lightly. There are some profound and difficult questions here. If you take a person's life, do you deserve one? Should we give someone a second or third chance at life if he has taken all of another person's chances? And even aside from murder, the effects of an assault or rape often last a lifetime. There's no statute of limitations on someone's pain or loss. What punishment fits a crime that destroys or damages another person forever? How much is enough? Some reformers argue that sentence length and prison conditions are different issues, so they should be kept separate. That while we need to improve the conditions of our prisons and jails and treat inmates more humanely, we can still lock them up for decades. For me, that's a difficult distinction to support. It's hard to think that 50 or 60 or 70 years behind bars can be humane. Those are the main arguments against. But both of these issues have another side. There are solid reasons to question the premise that our current policies have made us safer. A recent research review by the Brennan Center for Justice estimated that mass incarceration explained between 0 and 7% of the crime drop since the 1990s. Other researchers have suggested somewhat higher numbers, but the impact is still relatively small. No studies have shown that mass incarceration is the main reason for the reduction in violent crime. In fact, just as an aside, likely the main reason is demographics, and that is that the great majority of violent crime is committed by young men between the ages of 18 and 27. And there has been a significant decline in that particular population as US population growth has slowed. On the other hand, there is a growing body of evidence that lengthy or excessive prison sentences make us less safe. David Rodman of the Open Philanthropy Project conducted a review of research on longer prison terms. He concluded, and I'll quote him here, tougher sentences hardly deter crime, and while imprisoning people temporarily stops them from committing crime outside prison walls, it also tends to increase their criminality after release. As a result, tough on crime initiatives can reduce crime in the short run, but cause offsetting harm in the long run. A key reason for this is that the longer people are out of society, out of the workforce, out of the normal daily rhythms of life, the harder it is to reintegrate, so the more likely they are to reoffend upon release. And to go just a bit deeper, why does a 20-year cap on sentences or something in that range make sense? And if you want to show the next slide, Lauren. One of the few things we can definitively say about crime is that people age out of it. Most violent crimes are committed by males age 18 to 27 or 18 to 25. So every year thereafter, rates decline. For example, in an age-related study of robbery charges showed that arrest rates for 20-year-olds are 8 times that of 40-year-olds, and for 60-year-olds, there is virtually no risk. Part of the reason is physical or hormonal. Tendencies to violence are directly linked to testosterone levels. As we age, we have less excess energy, less need for action, less inclination toward risk-taking behavior. As someone has said, young men have an accelerator but no brakes. They're not well equipped to make good choices, control bad actions, or understand their consequences. As you can see, there are relevant social factors as well. Things like attending college, getting married, having a job or career, having children are all linked to lower levels of criminal behavior. So the longer we keep people in prison, the longer we undermine the ways they mature out of crime. And finally, 20 years is still a very long time. How different was the person you were at 38 from the one you were at 18? Or from 48 to 28? Many of us would say we were quite different people after those intervals. The same is true of criminals. And it's not exactly like we'd be letting them off scot-free. One day in prison is difficult. 20 years is an eternity. And 3 other likely benefits of capping sentences are worth mentioning. First, it would virtually force us to turn our focus back to rehabilitation and reentry into society. When we lock people up for 40 or 50 years or life, we don't need to think about them ever coming home. But if they'll be back among us in 10 years or 20 at the most, we know we'll need to help them prepare for that time, to teach the skills and mechanisms they will need to be successful, and to provide necessary services and support once they're released. Also, a significant reduction in the number of inmates would save billions of the dollars we now pay for warehousing them. That money could be used for expanded efforts in both improving prison conditions and opportunities and assisting prisoners' re-entry into society. The morality question, I think, is more complex and more vexing than any of the practical issues. What is an appropriate punishment for a particular crime? The Bible is clear that Christians should have a unique concern for those in prison. But should we also have a unique view of the proper punishment for crime? I think so, but I don't know exactly what it would be. There's no clear biblical word on this question that I know of. Bible times were obviously very different from now. We could draw an analogy to Israel's Jubilee concept, the idea that in the Sabbath of Sabbaths, every 50 years, prisoners and slaves were to be freed. That notion put a cap on servitude, but what it was depended on how near or how distant the Jubilee year was. In more general terms, as part of seeing prisoners as our brothers and sisters in Christ, and a belief that change and redemption are possible even for the worst sinners, there's a good argument that excessive sentences are not compatible with that goal. But that is open to debate. What I do know for certain is that when faced with violent crime and its often devastating results, punishment alone cannot give us what we most wish for or what we most need. We punish people to prevent more crimes, but punishment is also part of our effort to restore ourselves from the anxieties that such crimes raise about our ability to live with one another. We also seek some kind of repair. The legal process can never fully heal us. I have a deep respect for the law, but it neither finds the truth nor dispenses justice with the reliability it likes to claim. And even fair and proper punishment, whatever that is, does not remake the world as we would like it to be. In the presence of the violence and the cruelties we humans too often visit on one another, any sense of meaning and connection, restoration, must come from outside the law.
Tell me, is his screen still up here?
Yeah. I'm sorry. Do you need to change something, Lauren?
No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Anyway, so as I was saying, any sense of meaning and connection and restoration needs to come from outside the law. And that exactly should be our wheelhouse, our ministry to both criminals and victims and to society at large. Because the saving, transforming love of Jesus can change and heal any life, we should do all we can to create conditions where people, especially the least of these, can find and receive that love. Living and teaching that message is what we can offer, and precisely what those in prison most need. And part of that message, I believe, will be new ways to deal with violent crime and criminals. And I want to end on a hopeful note. Despite the great divisions and widespread anger everywhere in the land, I'm hopeful. I believe there are people of goodwill all around, even when I can't see them or don't expect them. In 2009, I represented a 17-year-old boy who was charged with killing another 17-year-old boy. I'll call him Curtis because, well, that was his name. Curtis was not a bad kid, just a typical teenager, a not very mature high school junior with no record beyond a minor drug offense. The whole incident was silly and senseless, an argument over a girl. Someone had left a gun in Curtis's house and he put it in his pocket before he went out. When the two boys got into it, the gun came out and the other boy was hit by a single shot at close range. As typically happens with the killing, Curtis was tried as an adult. He testified that he'd acted in self-defense, but the jurors were not convinced. After some significant deliberations, they found him guilty of first-degree murder. I dreaded the sentencing. It was always the worst part of being a public defender. I'd have to watch someone I cared about being consigned to the belly of the beast for decades, maybe life. They were all painful, but none more so than those for young clients. Curtis was a likable kid with a loving mother and sister, but the trial judge was a hard man. I knew that it would not be good. In court, the dead boy's mother spoke at some length with the mother's eloquence. She told the judge about her only son, what he had been like, some of his dreams and hopes for the future, what he and she had lost. She didn't minimize her grief or her pain at her son's passing. She said, I want this young man to be punished. I want him to go to prison. I want him to have to think about what he has taken from me, about what he's done that can never be undone. But then she turned to Curtis's mother and sister, who were also in the courtroom, and said some words that still amaze me. As best I can remember, she said, but I don't want another family to lose their brother, their son forever, as I have lost mine. I think maybe 15 or 20 years is enough punishment, enough time for him to face the consequences of his actions and resolve to change. Maybe then he can come out of prison and do some good, make some amends, have part of the life that my son might have had. Everyone in the courtroom was deeply moved, except for the judge. He gave Curtis 40 years to life anyway. He won't be eligible for release until 2044 when he'll be 52. If someone murdered my son or my daughter or one of my grandchildren, I don't know if I could ever say what that mother said. I just don't know. But I believe that for us as both Christians and citizens, her statement, her attitude point a way forward, a way toward a better criminal legal system in every sense, not just for those convicted of crimes, but for their victims, for those left behind, for all of us working and praying for a more just society. It's a hard road to get to that place of forgiveness and compassion and wisdom, but we'll never get there unless we start to take the first steps in that direction, however we can. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom. That's, I hope everyone can hear me. That is a lot to chew on. I don't know if we stated Tom's background early on, degrees in theology, journalism, and law. I know we have pastors among us. We have a couple of lawyers. We've got journalists, but I don't know if anybody has your triple threat qualifications. And your book, which I thought you were going to discuss about when innocence is not enough, and the Brian rule, Brady rule, and maybe we'll get into that. But I think other people have some things to say. I was interested both in the topic because I am an attorney, but I'm not a criminal law attorney. I have the exciting field of corporate tax law, which doesn't have much to do with, well, maybe criminals, but not dangerous ones, physically dangerous ones. I'm sorry my wife Gina is not available. We met in law school. She was both a prosecutor and later in her career a defense attorney, and has
She's got both sides. Yeah,
got both sides. And I do recall there is certainly a mentality on both sides. I think you were on the defense side for your career. When she came back after a hiatus, she left prosecuting after I think 19 years. Went and worked for Monterey Bay Academy in the Adventist system as a fundraiser and a teacher. Went back after 9 years and became a defense attorney. And one of the compliments I thought she received was the newer attorneys were shocked when they found out she had been a prosecutor in her earlier days, because she's very fair-minded. And looking only for guilty folks. I'm not sure what she would think about some of the punishments that are dished out, but I know she's very fair-minded. Anyway, very interesting. The other thing I noticed is this is one of the relatively few topics that wasn't SDA centric. This is a total nationwide issue that doesn't have anything to do with the church, but we all have an interest in it. The other thing, we are an international group. This related basically to U.S. criminal justice system, but I know we have folks from around the world, and I'd be interested in their view of how they view America and this issue, plus how they handle it in their own country. I think Steve Ferguson, I think the name was from Australia, had some comments in the chat, and I would encourage him to come on. I think, Lauren, you're up first. Why don't you unmute and give us your question?
Gladly. Tom, I was interested and tickled a little bit by your story at the beginning when you said you found that book and being a good Adventist boy and reading it and struggling with it. I had a similar experience only a little later when I was a young pastor, just starting ministry. They offered a CPE course, Clinical Pastoral Education, for those of you who don't know. And you had to choose an area of specialization. You had to do a project with your parish or somewhere in the community or something that you did. So I chose the minimum security prison in town. Wow, eye opener. I mean, I'm just telling you, total innocent Adventist boy, knew exactly what everything was supposed to be. And it was really hard on me. I mean, honestly hard, Tom. I remember coming home to my wife and saying, you have to do these interviews with people and verbatim, they record them, what you talked about them with. And I said, virtually everyone I talk to is playing a game with me. There's some weird thing going on. They're trying to convince me of something, or they're lying to me, and I know this. And this was really it was a culture shock in a sort of way. I had never experienced this before. But anyway, that's just to say that I suspect I'm still kind of that sort of person. I'm not sure that I ever really graduated to knowing quite what to do with people like that. But I want to ask you about something else. Have you noticed that in American society, it's become sort of a right of justice for people to say, my son's been killed, and I'm not going to rest until something is done. And the news reporter will the attorneys and the report they'll have a press conference, and everybody stands up and said, he killed my son, and I got to see. And I've often wondered, if that happened to me, would I have the ability to hang on for sometimes 5, 10 years and still stand up and say, I have this whole time been immersed in this thought of getting justice for my son or my daughter. I haven't been able to move on with life in all of this time. That seems unhealthy to me. And yet it is just expected. You hear any news about a violent crime, some particularly high profile crime, and they are going to speak as though, yes, it's perfectly natural for this person to put their entire life on hold for as many years as it takes to see somebody punished. You know what I'm talking about, Tom?
Uh, Certainly, and I mean, I think I do understand it, that having been a public defender for a long time, obviously, I think I've seen a whole range of reactions. And certainly, one of the very human things is to say, this has devastated my life. It changed my life forever. From this, and somehow the loss of whether a child, a family member, husband, wife, friend, and particularly when you may not know who did it, if the crime is not solved. Uh, it's open. How did this happen? You wonder, did they suffer? Did this? There's all kinds of these questions. Uh, I think that's very human. I think the sad thing, as you know, is that it can be like a cancer on the person. It's extremely hard. You say to someone, move on, get over it. Obviously, you don't ever get over something like that. Uh, I do think, from what I know of therapy and counseling, that if you can't find some way to accept it and possibly even some way to let it go, it's very hard to find healing. And I think what's interesting, one of the arguments for the death penalty is people say, well, I'll finally have closure if the person who killed my loved one, my friend, my family member is executed, then I'll feel some sense of relief. I think almost universally that doesn't happen. That the only way you find some relief is, if possible, you can find some way uh, to forgive. I don't know how you do that, but I do know I teach a class for women at the Boulder jail here, and we often talking about the impacts of crime. And what I've realized is, we forgive not for the sake of the other person, but for the sake of ourselves. It's a healing. It's I think often the only way to begin healing yourself, but I don't know how you all find that way. I've never had to deal with it. I've never had someone close to me be murdered. I've seen it happen too many times. I've been involved in too many, but it's not me. So I don't know that that's helpful, but I think uh, it's like many things. It's a grievous, grievous wound to a person. And until they can find some way to come to terms with it, let it go, to maybe even forgive, that it's they may never find healing.
Thank you.
I'm asking Brian Ness to unmute, and I don't think my command is working. Can I get some help here,
Oh
Lauren?
no, it worked.
There we go.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
Brian, I
It
should
worked.
say, just stop and say he's one of my favorite presenters, and I think he's coming up in a week or two. I'll be interested
Well,
in
I
his
just
topic
looked at
this time.
I looked at my calendar. It's actually March 15. So it's a little while yet. And Lauren, you inspired me. I put my ocean scene behind me, so we have both oceans here today. Uh, and this topic has been one on my heart for a long time, because I a long time ago when I was at Walla Walla, and that's where I know Tom from, and I don't know him as a defender, in court, but his time at Walla Walla College, and when I was there, we had a penitentiary nearby, the Walla Walla Penitentiary, and I did get involved a little bit in prison ministries and visited there, and it's definitely an interesting experience, and I could say more about it, but it's been a long time ago, and I haven't done much since. But one thing that struck me is, especially in recent times, we now have this big divide in our country about, how much crime we have, first off, and there are people who say we have a crime wave. It's the worst it's ever been, which the numbers don't support. But there are those that believe that, and they want to get tough on crime, and that's a big deal too. And I'm just wondering, from a Christian perspective, it seems like so many of those driving that tough on crime are actually from the evangelical and Christian community, and it puzzles me a bit, but here's the deal: the Bible's kind of, you could, depend on where you look. The Old Testament is focused on punishment. Jesus tends to look more at redemption, and I tend to believe that Jesus helped us a lot in trying to push us in that direction. And I wonder, why is the church still many times stuck on the punishment side? Because if we really want to get a handle on this, I think redemption, and in fact rehabilitation, really should be our focus. But we've lost that, and I mean, it seems like we now just literally just punish. We don't try to rehabilitate any longer. Those efforts are so minimal. And I'd like to compare ourselves to Norway, which does do a lot in the area of getting people ready to come out. Because in our own country, not only is it hard to get out, but once you get out, nobody will hire you because you have a record. And there's even laws to try and battle that, but it's been very difficult. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, and how do we get the Christian community to think about this more deeply, to figure out, well, isn't rehabilitation what we believe? I mean, isn't that, as a Christian, don't I believe that redemption is possible for anyone? And therefore, shouldn't I be encouraging that in our prison system to bring about redemption and rehabilitation rather than just punishment? So I don't know, your thoughts on that. I mean, how do we
Well,
shift that? Yeah.
I wish I do. I mean, I think you've asked a huge question, that the whole idea, I think the problem, Christian nationalism, the question is how Christian is, they have the name,
Mm.
but they don't seem to be very interested in what Jesus taught and how he lived. I mean, I don't really know how you change it, but I think it's hard to see some of these people to talk about others. I mean, as I think perhaps the simplest come is that, don't we sing and always say, "I'm just a sinner saved by grace"? And isn't that in fact apply to make us all equal? But I think that in my mind anyway, it's part of the efforts to divide people, to feel better that we are the sort of white Christian nationalists are the chosen, and everyone else is different. Immigrants, poor people, people of color, they're all other somehow, and certainly prisoners. They're all others. And so we don't have to, I think J.D. Vance was saying something yesterday like, well, first we love our family and then we love our neighbor, and thinking of the person who lives next door to him, not Jesus' definition of who is my neighbor, but anyone in need. But, Brian, I mean, I have no idea. I think that uh, the discussion, and it pains me that it's become so involved in politics and what are your politics, that we can't just talk about people. We can't talk about people in need as our community members too, as people we should care about. They're just over there, and we're here, and we're the chosen, and we've got to defend our rights. And I mean, that's
Yeah.
I
No,
don't have an answer. I don't know.
yeah. And I think I'm just expressing frustration because we can't even have a conversation often, like you say. I mean, and for me, part of the problem with the conversation is that we can't even agree on where the facts lie because, the current issue with immigrants, for example, that they're driving crime, when in fact crime rates among immigrants are lower than among, naturalized Americans. So it's difficult to have a conversation when we can't even agree on where the numbers are, and that crime's lower than it was in the 90s, for example. So,
Right. And I mean, part of the current atmosphere also is that the facts and the truth don't matter. We just
Mhm.
people, whatever they want to believe is the truth, and that's the
Yeah.
way it is.
So I
Yeah.
guess we commiserate, but yeah,
Yeah.
I keep pushing people and say, think about these as people. They're people, and I think that's where we have to start because each person in prison is a person, um, no matter how bad of crime they've done. And I don't know if it happened to me, if a family member was injured, I don't know if I could talk that way, like you said. I don't know if I could be as gracious, but I hope I would. That's my hope because I
Yeah.
believe that's what we should try and do. So,
I
well, anyway,
agree. Well,
thank you.
good luck.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna have to duck out soon here, but I've appreciated hearing this, and it's close to my heart because I just think our country needs some healing, and this is one of the areas where healing needs to happen.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I'm impressed with your presentation, Tom, laying out some maybe controversial reforms in the sentencing and incarceration. But you are among very few people who dealt with it both as a volunteer and a pastor in the prison situation, then as an attorney defending these people. So I think we have to have some deference to your knowledge and observation powers and your work in this. It's I can think vividly of the several times when family members of a murder victim, have come out and said they forgive the murderer. They don't necessarily say cut them loose out of prison, but they always say they forgive them, and it creates a huge story because people can't understand how they can actually do that. It takes a real firm faith. Anyway, Patty's up. Tell us what you're on your mind, Patty.
Oh, well, first of all, I want to say hi. I was in the Loma Linda area too. I grew up around there, went to Loma Linda Academy. But I think I'm a few years after you. My sister was in the class of 64, and I was in the class of 68. So, anyway, hi from that standpoint. Always nice to see a fellow Californian. Um, my question has kind of to do with the generational aspect of crime. There's a lot of talk about uh, criminals, a higher rate of criminals when there's not a father present in the home. And you didn't really touch on that. And I would like to just get your opinion of how you think about that.
Um, uh, yeah, I think absolutely it's true that in a home where there's absent father, and very often it happens with particularly with poor and people of color, the father may be in prison. Um, that certainly has an impact, and I think it is one of the further costs of our heavy rate of incarceration, that when we separate families, obviously, then that puts stress on their finances, on their raising, how they're raised, on their care and their nurture. And all of these things make them likely to, be more likely to end up in trouble, and then at some point, probably end up in prison. Certainly, we see that repeatedly in poor communities where there's a high percentage of men, young men particularly, in prison, and they're not there to help their families. So I think that's a very high collateral cost, and that by the same token, if we could find ways, if more of these men, instead of being sent away for long prison terms, were in situations where they could learn skills, learn even including parenting skills, but get financial help, deal with drug problems. Many of them have mental health issues. That if we were looking at this as a way of, I think it has to do with our whole approach. We say, you committed a crime, so we're going to punish you. Instead of saying, all right, you committed a crime, why? Can we understand this? Was it because you were trying to get money for your family, which it sometimes is? Is it because you were high on drugs? Is it because you have, mental health problems? Can we at least try to understand the person, not just the act, and how we could prevent this from happening again or from other people? That the causes of crime are generally not a mystery. It's not that someone is born evil. I know there are psychopaths, but basically, if you look in almost every case, and again, I've been struck by this in teaching. I dealt in D.C. with generally more serious major crimes. Here, I'm retired now. I teach a class at the Boulder County Jail for women. And I typically, let's say there's 10 to 15, and it's a class about trying to help them learn empathy, understand their victims and the trouble they caused, and how they can overcome that. In any given, if I say, how many of you have been physically abused? Everyone raise your hand. How many of you have been sexually abused? Probably all but one, and often repeatedly. How many, you could draw a straight line to what's happened to them and what they've ended up doing, whether it's a drug crime or in some cases, it is a violent crime. But you can understand the steps, how they got there, and it makes complete sense. And I often say there, but for the grace of God, if that had been me, I would have ended up here too. It's not a mystery, but we don't want to focus on the resources, the understanding, the helping, the caring that could change so many of these outcomes. We want to just punish. And I say we in general as a country. And I think that's why I feel that Christians could be having a role in playing that part, in seeing these people as human, as God's children, as people worthy of love and care, deserving of help, who can be changed and reformed if we're willing to put in the time and effort and money. That's a very long answer to your question.
There was an incident in my town just this week where I won't call him a gentleman, where a man shot his ex-wife in her driveway. And they were both prominent members of the community. But 20 years earlier, his father and mother had been killed in a murder-suicide. So Brian probably would know this, is there any sort of possible physiological link between generations that can make people more susceptible to this? not just the environment, but maybe the biology?
That's completely outside of my area of expertise, but I don't believe that it's genetic in the sense we usually think of it. I think that it may be situational that, for example, we do know that people who are sexually abused children, a huge percentage of them were sexually abused when they were children. And has nothing to do with genetics. It has to do with experience, with trauma, with dealing with trauma, with being able to develop normal sexuality and those kinds of things. So I think that there's a very powerful environmental component. Whether there's also a genetic component, I'm not qualified to speak on that at all.
I'm sorry that Brian Ness left so early. He might have a comment on genetic or DNA component to these things. I think he's been involved in that. Now, Ed Reefsnyder had questions right from the get-go. So, Ed, you're up. Go ahead and fire away.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Tom. I live in Fort Collins. We should connect sometime.
Should, yeah.
I have two questions I would like to ask you. Before that, just a brief statement. I don't know that we'll ever make meaningful progress on the question of crime and punishment unless we can pry it out of the political sphere into the sphere of reason and research. It's just a political football. You know, you gain points by alarmism or whatever your political preference is. But I'm feeling a little jaundiced about progress as long as it's a political football. My first question is I consulted that supreme source of theological wisdom, ChatGPT. And I asked ChatGPT how prisoners were fed in the era that Jesus lived in. And it says prisoners were generally not provided food by the state. Instead, they relied on family, friends, or charitable individuals to bring them meals. Does this reality of what being a prisoner looked like in those times change the way we view Jesus' words about I was in prison and you visited me? In other words, was it more than just a friendship or a personal spiritual boost or witnessing or whatever? Was it just really something more practical? That people in prison were known to starve to death if somebody didn't bring them food because the jail wasn't going to feed them. That's my first question. Does it cast a different view on Jesus' injunction to visit those in prison? My second question is all this that we've discussed during your really good presentation a matter primarily for the individual Christian, or is it something that should be taken on more communally, like as a denomination project or something of that nature, or as a church project instead of an individual project? Those are my two questions for you.
Sure. I think of the first one, that's an interesting observation, and probably, as you say, visiting prisoners may have been, in those times for food, the difference between literal survival or not. But I think the point is still there that those people had particular needs and that weren't being met. And that was something that Jesus wanted his followers to care for, because these people were still in prison for some reason. They had done something to offend society or someone. And so they were still, in a sense, outcasts, and what they may have needed then most was food. I think there are plenty of very serious human needs that are not met by prisons today that visiting can help. One of them is just, links to that they may be fed at least food that will keep them alive, but they may not have any human connections that are also necessary for life. I think there are other need that visiting now provides. Many people have no family, no one to visit them, particularly long timers. Their family may be halfway across the country. And there are programs, I think very useful programs, that encourage visitation just for social contact, just for human relationships that's essential for survival too. So I think the specific most important needs may be different now, but I think the concept is very much needed of providing something necessary. And which sort of leads me into your second question. I do wish and would hope that while it's important for individuals to do things, I think if there were organizational efforts, that it could make it a lot easier. That, for example, there's a program that I've been somewhat involved with called Prisoner Visitation and Support, where they particularly, what people basically do is they connect you with someone in prison in your local area who doesn't have family close by, doesn't have typical support, someone that you can visit, and they help to provide sort of some background training and understanding so that you can have a sense of what it might be like, have someone you can ask questions to if you're not sure how to relate, something happens. That basically, if the church did have a program like that, or it would make it easier for individuals who did want to be involved to do something, because it certainly be daunting. I can understand. So I mean, do I go up and knock on the door of the Walla Walla Penitentiary and say, I'm here to visit prisoners because that's what Jesus wants me to do? That's not a very easy thing. But so if the church, which I would love, saw that more as a priority and set up programs, and some, by the way, some churches do, some local churches do that. That's how my old friend Sam Tannehill, that's how he was saved, by some two Adventist men visiting the prison. But yeah, I think it would, if there were organized programs, it would make it easier, but we don't necessarily have to wait for them to find ways to get involved.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Our next participant is you're labeled Branson Legacy Sabbath School. Can you tell us your name and exactly where you're located? And welcome.
I'm Dave Larson, and I'm in Beaumont, California. Spent most of my life in Loma Linda.
Go right ahead with your question or comment.
Well, I want to just say hi to Tom. I'm part of his previous life, and he might not remember me, but I remember him.
No, I certainly remember you. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Tom, I couldn't be here earlier, and you have probably or perhaps mentioned this. My issue is 1 day in a cell. 1 day in a cell, particularly with two people in that very small area, and being confined that way, just thinking about it, nearly drives me over the wall. And my question is, do you know of any place where prisoners are housed in something more commodious than one little cell?
Sure. I think that there are obviously a variety of prisons and different kinds, and much of it has to do with what's deemed your security level. That in a maximum security prison, typically everyone is housed in a smallish cell. There may be slightly bigger or smaller, but they're very confined. There certainly are minimum security prisons, and even sometimes they call them country club prisons, where they will send white collar, particularly people who are not deemed to be dangerous, and they are in more dormitory like settings. I mean, still, you know, more crowded than one would like, but in dormitory like settings with pods where you have more space, and some of them even have, you know, kitchen areas and, you know, lounge areas that are much more, you know, I guess, comfortable and livable environments. Um, but that's not a highly popular idea. That there are many prisons, even maximum security prisons in other places, like Norway is very advanced in its treatment of prisoners, where they do have units, even a maximum security prison, where people are in very open areas. They're able to cook their own food. They're able to do some working and so on. And I think they found generally the results are much better than these harsh conditions. But we're pretty much stuck. Anytime if you're in a maximum or even a medium security prison, you're pretty much confined. And I think if you've never been in that situation, it's hard. You know, you try to imagine it. I think people have, many of my clients said to me at some point, you know, when I first went to prison, if they hadn't been there before, that I didn't think I could survive one day in this circumstance, let alone 1 month, 1 year, 10 years, 50 years. Um, I think that the punishment is supposed to be that you are locked up. But I think often the punishment is also the conditions under which you're kept are inhumane.
Hmm. Thank you.
Very good. I see one of our regulars, Ed Zerkwitz, is also reclining somewhere by a mountain lake. If you go ahead, Ed, and ask your question or comment.
Yes, thank you, Tom, for raising this important topic. There are not. I'm going to go to the area of crime prevention, and I know there's a number of crime prevention initiatives in the United States and Canada. One I remember about a dozen years ago, reading about it, and people being interviewed, was there was a small community somewhere, I don't know where it was, in rural America, and they had about 2,000 population, and they had a sheriff and a half-time police officer, and they couldn't. The city council or the town council was looking at increasing the policing, but there was no room in their budget. So they got creative, and what they came up with, long and short of it, is that the community adults would get to know all the younger members and teenagers' names. So whenever they saw them in the community, they would say hi to them and engage in speaking to them. And then in the evenings, they found out that busy streets are safer streets. In other words, if there was more of the locals driving around or walking around even, then that reduced the crime rate. Another thing they did was they spruced up the community. They got rid of graffiti. They cut lawns where the grass was too high. They fixed fences. They painted and fixed broken glass windows, sides of buildings. They painted, and so on, fences, whatever. And they, well, the children might have been involved too, but the whole community got involved, and they discovered after a year that the crime rate had dropped about 50%. So they took that model, a group of, and I forget all the details, but a community, a sociology group at a university not too far away, I think, decided to take that to about 20 Canadian and American cities of all sizes. So in the bigger cities, they chose particular neighborhoods. And then they went back 2 years later, looked at what they took pictures before and after and videos. And what they discovered 2 years later when they went back was the community was still looking after, or they were still doing those things. And the average crime rate dropped from about 40 to 70%, depending on the situation. So I just thought if, I know there's I was just looking up before today's program, I was looking at, I try to get an idea of how many crime prevention groups or societies or whatever there are in the United States and Canada, and there's hundreds of them, but I don't know what that really means. But what are your thoughts on this kind of approach? How could it take? Would there be a lot of interest in promoting that, in our whatever towns and legislatures and whatever, or not?
Well, you'd think there should be, particularly because of how effective they've been. But I think that, again, we're just locked into, I think, a particular model of punishment. And it's very hard to break that cycle because the program you mentioned, I've read about. I think it's incredible how effective it is. And it shows us that particularly if you can get young people who may be headed for trouble to become, part of a community, to be cared about, to be cared for, and steered in the right direction, that you can alter their entire life. And over and over. And it's not really rocket science. I think it's some pretty simple sociology and just human relations. But I think we just don't want to put resources and focus on those kinds of things because that's, coddling criminals. It's so many people, even if you have someone say, this person needs treatment, this person needs training, this person needs help, but this person needs to be punishment. They committed a crime. We got to punish them for this crime, rather than, again, how can we start to solve this? And I think, we used to have a much more, particularly for younger people. I think, we didn't try them. 14 and 15-year-olds, we didn't try them as adults because we understood they were children. But we've just gotten more harsh across the board. So there should be interest in those programs. I think in the right places there would be. But even when you can show the results, people are resistant because, we've got to somehow punish these people. They've done something wrong, so we can't let them off. And I think that stands in the way of a lot of progress, and a lot of programs that could be successful if we would try them.
Yeah, the benefits of this kind of a program are so immense. Like you get the community involved, you prevent all that court system and prison system and, all kinds of situations.
Yeah, I mean, it's beneficial from all sides. It prevents crime, but it could also save billions and billions of dollars that we spend on incarceration and punishment and police. But there just isn't much interest and support in general, unfortunately.
All right, Lauren, I think oh, there we go. My co-host status just came back on board. So let's see. Next up is Florin Liga. I'm not sure I got that name right, sir. If you can unmute and tell us, pronounce your name for me. Tell me where you're calling from.
Yes, that's the right name, Florin
Okay.
Liga. Presently, I'm in North Carolina. Thank you, Tom, for the presentation. And I connected with the topic because about 13 years ago, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on prison ministry. So I had an extensive, maybe 35 years of working that, actually being involved with that. And there are two personal reasons. So I like to give my perspective to this one, and then I have a question for you. So the first reason, I grew up in the country of Romania. And there I have my father as a political prisoner. And under the communist regime, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for keeping the Sabbath. So that was my direct link with that. The second one, a story that I put it into my introduction in my dissertation. When my father was a child, his father, so my grandfather, was killed into the Second World War. So being a large family of kids, my father uncle decided to take my father as his own son and take care of him until he grew up. However, that was a reason for him to take a boy because he replaced his own boy. My father's uncle, coming from the war, he embraced Adventism. So he had a transformational behavior overall. And one day when the drunk cop passed through their house, his son, like my father's cousin, 16 years old, was in the yard. And the cop came to him to the fence and said, "Boy, come here. You are an Adventist. Let me curse for me." They knew that the Adventists are not cursing. So the boy refused to curse 3 times. And he was threatened with, the cop said, "If you are not going to curse for me, I'm going to kill you, to shoot you." So being drunk, that happened. So he took the gun and killed the boy. And I remember that was for me revelation and starting way to come close to prison ministry. To the court was a martial court, and the district attorney asked maximum sentence for the cop. My father's uncle knew some good years, 5-6 years conversion into Adventism. He stood up into the court and he says, "Your Honor, I do request, however, to give no sentence for this guy. He has 5 kids into his home, and I don't want their kids to grow up without father." So they granted that request without, he was taken out of from the police, but that happened. So these 2 reasons gave me some attraction to get involved very young into the prison ministry, first in the country of Romania, and since I came here 31 years ago, I had an extensive, being a pastor as well, an extensive activity ministry into the jail ministry, prison ministry. For example, I had, while in Illinois, when we moved out from there, I had about 4 years of prison ministry in one of the high security prisons there, where I had the privilege to baptize around 50 people. After working with them, being a prison chaplain on the part-time, of course. When I left in 2012 from the state of Illinois, I had a person, I think actually he was a treasurer from 3ABN. It has nothing to do, I don't want to involve 3ABN, but he was a treasurer there. When he learned that I'm moving out from that place, he came to me and said, "Can you help me? Put me into the ministry, because I have the passion, I have a desire to work with prisoners." And I said, "Okay, I can do that, But why is the reason? He said, my son is in prison in California. I can go once per year to see him. But knowing him there, I would like to be available for others into my place where I'm here. I'm able to do that once per week, to be there a couple of hours and to do something for the people. So what I realize is that in this ministry, it makes a lot of difference if you know someone or you are related with someone that it's locked up for good reason, as guilty or not. That's a different story. So it's a difference talking generally speaking about the prisoners and the philosophy of prison ministry or prison incarceration or others, and being directly related with that. So I'm stopping here with the comments, and I would like to ask you my question. So.
Florin, you become okay. You're becoming unmuted. Can you unmute again? Wait a minute. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. You're good. You're good.
Okay, I'm good. So my question is this: how do you cope with prison as guilty or not guilty when justice is not present? And I'm talking of those regimes around the world. Here we are blessed to have some justice, but many places of the world, they do not have that luxury, availability for justice. How do we cope with prison being there without the justice system to protect it?
Whoa, I wish I could answer that question. I think it's obviously if someone is in prison for a just cause, that they've committed some crime, and they're there for a reason, that justice was done, at least in finding them guilty of something. And so I think it's probably easier in some ways for the person. I mean, many of my clients would say, I deserve some kind of punishment. I've done wrong, and in some ways, that's certainly easier to do time, I think, if you know you're guilty and you're trying to change. I think it's probably easier to be there, but I don't know. I think dealing with unjust reform, where people are particularly political prisoners, as often was in Eastern Europe, and still is many parts of the world. All I can say is they still need the same kind of human contact, whether you're there for right reason or the wrong reason. They are still people who obviously need human contact, need to people need to know that someone cares about them, that someone cares about their. So I think it still has the same urgency of something that we should be doing, but the political side, just as someone else mentioned here today in the U.S., it's become a very political issue. Treatment of prisoners, it's more so in other places. But where we can't change that, I think we still have the obligation to do what we can to maintain contact, to not let these people feel like they are forgotten or discarded or worthless in God's eyes.
Tom, this is Lauren. Something that I've heard, and this relates to what Florin was talking about, is that in Bible times, all of those prisoners were people who were religious prisoners. They were all people who were being persecuted for Christ's sake. They weren't violent prisoners. They weren't people who stole or robbed. So the people who stole or robbed, you can ignore. Only those who are being imprisoned for Christ's sake and being persecuted are the ones that we're really talking about. I don't think that argument holds water, but I've heard it.
Well, I think when as we all have done, when there's something in the Bible that we don't particularly like or don't want to comply with, we come up with a new interpretation
Exactly.
that fits what we'd like to do. I think we've all probably been guilty of that at times. But I agree. I don't think, I mean, one thing we always like to say is that the Bible is universal. It was certainly written at a particular time, but that we don't say, you know, love your enemies was fine in Jesus' day, but well, we can't do that anymore. That was then. This is now. I think, I think you're right that those dodges don't really hold up.
All right, next up is Linda. Thank you for your patience, Linda. Go ahead with your comment or question.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom, for your presentation. I'm a big believer in prison reform, but I had to learn. I'm not necessarily with the punishment part, even though I think there are consequences. I'm African American, Black. Grew up in a poor family. Right now, I'm about to earn my doctorate degree. I'm writing my capstone. Hopefully, it'll be approved by the dean in a few weeks. Grew up with people that, for some reason, made wrong choices because Jesus came into my life not as a Seventh-day Adventist, but just as a savior early in life. Not with an organized religion, but just knowing that there was a God, and making choices based on that. And I've worked with prisoners until I needed therapy myself years ago. And I say that because when you're working with prisoners, I need it. And I believe that's true for other people. You need to be balanced yourself and right motives, because there's a lot of gaslighting going on. And the first biggie for me is if that prisoner takes no responsibility. And I'm not talking about discussing the crime. I don't, like this particular person, knew from a teen and went into prison over and over and over and over again, just come out, get a good job, got bored, get with another group of people, and they getting robbed because that was excited over and over and over again. I just choose him as one because I've known several. Don't take responsibility. Whenever the judge or the defense or the prosecutor, they try to talk with him, oh no, it's somebody else's fault. It's my mom that's been dead for I don't know how many years fault, and because she didn't abort me when she was raped. And I mean, he'll snatch up everything and gaslight. I've done so much as a friend, not as a girlfriend or whatever, as a friend, put money on the books, put, I think they call it canteen, visit through, writing back and forth, trying to be a witness, not pointing my finger, not putting Jesus in his face, because he knows the Bible better than I do. And I learned that I had to distance myself from that because I had to get healthy. And this has been several years now, about 2 years at least, because the gaslighting. Well, I don't have nothing to eat. You're supposed to be a Christian. And I'd end up going to the fast food place, getting a bucket of chicken. Then he'd take it to his friends and they'd eat. Oh, I can't do this. I can't do this. I don't have gas in my truck. You're supposed to be a Christian. And I would fall for it every time with different people. Not just him, with different women. And I learned, hey, these people are not taking responsibility. And with him, he's been through all kind of classes in prison to try to get him to take responsibility. And they weren't talking about hammering down on him. It's slowly saying, the choice I made to rob that person, to shoot him, Thank God the person didn't die who was shot. That was me. I did that. God can forgive me, but I can't. I've got to. Whatever the therapist or whoever the program that he was in, AA, NA, whatever in prison, whenever they get him to take responsibility, no, they back out. So I had to learn to prison ministry for me now is praying, and maybe God will lead me back into a area where I will be more balanced and maybe take classes uh, before I go in, because prisoners are smart. This man
Well,
in
yeah.
prison had earned a master's degree. Went in without a GED, had earned a master's degree. He was smart. He knew how to talk.
Uh,
He knew how to gaslight, how to do several things, how he was such a, had started off life bad. Well, you're 20 years away from that.
yeah.
What?
Well,
You
no, I hear what you're saying, and I think obviously we didn't talk about this. I it would be very misleading to think that going to visit prisoners is simple, or that there aren't immense challenges involved in that, which is, again, I think one reason, an argument to be part of a program that can help you be prepared to deal with some of that. But, I guess I would also come back to say, what Jesus asked us to do is not always easy or simple, but he may still be asking us to do that. It's a real challenge. And I appreciate your commitment to doing what you can, and I think that's all that any of us can do.
Thank you,
Thank you a lot,
Linda.
Linda. Yeah, let me pivot back to Lauren before we go to our own Dr. Angie. Go ahead, Lauren.
Yeah, I'm just going to break in here. I usually about this time I break in and let you know what we have coming up in the weeks that are coming that are following. Next week we have another of our regular teachers who I always enjoy listening to. Jim Wiberding is a professor at Pacific Union College, a bit of a historian. Actually, quite a historian, good historian, and he likes to do local histories. But he told me that the general theme of what he's going to be talking about next week, he's been studying how the church gains strength on the West Coast, and of course, we all know everywhere up and down the West Coast, Seventh Adventist is as strong as it is anywhere in the U.S., probably along with Florida and Maryland. But the overriding concern is going to be how growth and strength comes through diversity. And that's something that we at Adventist today believe in very, very much. So it'll be good to have Jim back again. Andreas Bachman from Friedenshaus is going to be here on the 15th. And again, we're going to do something that harkens back to what Jeff Regang did for us a few weeks ago on Bonhoeffer. This time, Andreas is going to be talking to us about the Barmen Declaration. I'm inviting in March. I'm inviting a new teacher, and I love doing this. We can always have well-known people present for us, but I really feel it's important for us to have teachers who we don't know as well. And this is a young pastor from Europe named Marcelo Rice. And Marcelo is going to be presenting to us. I believe he's going to be doing a theology of the Lord's Supper, which is something we haven't done for a while. And then on the 8th of March, Stephen Ferguson. I'm so glad to have Stephen. Stephen is one of my favorite writers on the website. He always has interesting things to say. He is technically a layperson, but trained in theology, and has written a couple of books on various topics. And he's going to be talking to us. I thought this is an interesting topic. He's going to be talking to us about why we speak of spaces or things as being holy. Now, think about that. Bless the food. what happens to the food? We don't thank the Lord for the food. We bless the food. What does that mean? We have a sanctuary. And so he's going to be talking. That's just a few of the people that we have coming up. And I'm really looking forward to these new topics. So wanted you to know that. And just to keep in mind here, we're running short of time. Tom, can you stay for a little bit longer?
Oh, sure, I'm here.
Okay. So we'll move along then. Thanks for letting me cut in here and give you a little update of what's coming up next.
Sure, you're always welcome. I'm looking for Dr. Angie Lim to come in. I'm trying to get an unmute response. Go ahead, Dr. Angie. Go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Very impressed with it. Just a little of my background. I did go to law school, but I dropped after the first semester. Didn't think it was for me. Went to medical school and have been a psychiatrist for 31 years now. Having said that, I still have a lot of interest in especially criminal cases and criminal minds and all that goes with that. And your proposal of a 20-year cap on a prison sentence, very intriguing to me. I know some countries, especially in Europe, do have those. A particular case that has grabbed my attention for the past few years happened right here in the United States. That case happened in Frederick, Colorado in 2018. A young man by the name of Chris Watts killed his pregnant wife and two daughters, ages 4 and 3. Not only the crime was horrific, but the way that he disposed of the bodies was even worse. He worked on a oil field and he took the two little girls after he killed them and he dumped their bodies on oil tanks. And the wife was 15 weeks pregnant with a baby boy. So he basically killed 4 people, the 2 little girls, the wife, and the unborn child. This is a person who was not a domestic violence accuser. He was by all means and all purposes a good dad, good father, good spouse, grew up in an intact family. So the case was really, really earth-shattering for a lot of people, including me. And it has been 7 years now, and people are still talking about it. And I still go to a lot of YouTube channels, true crime, that are still dissecting and talking about the case of Chris Watts. He was convicted of all the crimes, sentenced to death. However, the family of Shanae Watts, his wife, requested the court not to give him the death penalty. Therefore, he was sentenced to life prison without parole. Now, by all intents and purposes, this person is a psychopath. He is a psychopath by psychiatric definitions. He is not a person who is treatable, unfortunately, in psychiatry terms. There is no treatment for sociopaths and psychopaths. These persons have a psychic defect, and I'm not saying this genetic. They have a psychic defect that cannot be cured or even treated because they have no empathy, they have no ability to feel remorse. And so in his case, though, if he were to leave prison right now, do I think he would be a danger to society or to the community? No, I don't. Even though he's a psychopath, he committed a very targeted crime, and there was a reason for that. And the reason was he had a mistress, and even though this has never been proven, the conclusion is that the mistress gave him an ultimatum, was either his family or her, and he chose her and eliminated his family to be with her. So I don't think that he would be a danger to society right now if he would let go, or a danger to the community. But he's still a psychopath. So in a case like this, my question is, would you still think that a 20-year sentence would be appropriate for Mr. Watts?
That's a good question. I should tell you, actually, I live about 10 miles from where this all happened.
Wow.
very familiar with his case, and it was just a horrific case. I think you're probably right. It was he may well be a psychopath. Um, it's always the extreme cases that test any principle or any idea, and this is certainly one. Um, I don't know if he's dangerous or not. Uh, if 20 years from now he will be dangerous, and I'm not a psychiatrist, so I'll accept that that he may well be a psychopath and may be untreatable. Um, but first of all, I think he is a kind of rare exception, and secondly, I think that there would be people. I'm sure I could find psychiatrists who would say that he is dangerous because he's a psychopath, and given the right circumstances, he might reoffend. Um, I don't know. Also, I'm not a psychiatrist. Whether in fact uh, could um, the the power of God, could he be redeemed? I don't know. I think your feeling is he couldn't. I don't know. But I don't think, again, in his case, there are always exceptions. It's the extreme case. Um, but I think that represents a very tiny fraction of the violent crime in this country, and may require some special kind of treatment that I'm not sure I know about. So anyway, thank you for raising that. That's really a difficult one.
Thank you.
Tom, let me ask you something. When I was doing my CPE in the prison, I remember the prison warden. I got to be pretty good friends with, well, both in the men's and the women's prison. I remember the women's prison, they were side by side, actually. She said, half or maybe more of my inmates are mentally ill. I thought, wow, really? And do you know anything about the background of that? Is that a fair representation?
I can't put a number on it, but yes, I think again, from all I know for sure are the clients that I had over many years, the clients that my colleagues had, and a very significant percentage of them have, I kind of read what your definition of mentally ill would be, but they have
Right.
significant mental health issues that contribute to their negative behavior. I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah, I should be clear. She said they're either mentally ill or they're mentally extremely deficient.
Yeah, that there's some issue, some cognitive or physiological issue that does impact their behavior. I think, yes, I think a very high percent. I mean, we saw what happened when Ronald Reagan and something, they closed down a lot of the mental health treatment centers. We saw a significant increase in certain kinds of crimes that are often associated with those people. So yes, it's a very high number. Uh, and I think that's another area of many of yours where if we did have treatment, better treatment for that, broader treatment for that, we could see significant reductions in crime.
Yes, Francis, you've been very patient. Go ahead with what your question or comment is.
Thank you. I read some time ago that our prisons are becoming places where we house older people because of the long sentences. And if they can't be released back to their families, this might be an area where people would feel comfortable visiting older 70, 80-year-old people. But also there's another way you can visit without actually going to the prison. We had a former student contact us, and she was in prison for drunk driving. They locked her up after 2 times. So she wanted us to help her. So she wanted a Bible. Paul sent her a Bible. She wanted a book. Paul sent her the books that she wanted. And I called her every week. Now it cost a little bit, but it was so worth it. So that's another way that possibly we could reach out to these people without actually going into the prison.
Yes, I think just the human contact, just the knowledge that someone out there is thinking of them, cares about them, I think is of immense value. Thank you, Francis.
Thank you, Francis. Eduardo, I'm trying to ask you to unmute. I like your background photo, your humble village there. Let me try that again. Boom. It should have a little click that asks asks you to unmute.
Let's get Linda in here, and then we'll see.
Okay, yeah.
So Eduardo can figure
Linda,
that out.
why don't you jump in, and we'll come back to Eduardo if we can.
Sure, I can do that. Hi, Tom. Tom, weren't you at La Sierra in 1966?
I was indeed. I do remember you.
And I think we got in trouble together on the school newspaper somehow.
I seem to remember that, but I think I've repressed it a little bit.
Good thought. Well, you may also recall then that it was in the fall of 1966 that my father was murdered. He was a periodontist in Texas, where I came from, and he was murdered. The only reason I mention it really has to do with the questions about retributive justice that have been brought up. And I find it very curious that many of my very conservative, I would describe as right-wing friends, they are very anti-abortion, but they love capital punishment. And it's a strange hypocrisy. I saw Melody just throw her hands up. Yes, it is a strange hypocrisy. And I still to this day do not understand it. But I can say, just from my own experience, that whatever, and the man who murdered my father, he was found in, Texas justice is a little wormy. He never actually went to jail, even though it was murder one. But whatever happened to the perpetrator, at least in my personal experience, did not have any effect on my life. I mean, it wasn't that I was going to feel that the thing had come full circle or that justice had been rendered, depending on what the outcome of that was. The principal issue for me is that my father was gone. And so it, people I think are misguided sometimes, who lose loved ones in a terrible crime and believe that they're going to have some sort of emotional satisfaction as a result of a severe sentence or even a death sentence. And at least in my own experience, that's not the case. But Lauren stole my question, because I was going to ask you, and I think there's no doubt that we all agree on it, that at least in California, because that's where I was in 1968, 69, when Reagan did away with all the mental health institutions for all intents and purposes. And as a result, there was a subsequent uptick in crime. And I wonder if that still is not part of the issue today, when we see these huge increases in incarceration rates. And I wonder if they're not related to the lack of, or the diminution of, free and readily available mental health services.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the problem is now, if you are mentally ill or incapacitated some way and you commit a crime, we send you to jail or prison. And, what could be a worse environment for someone with a mental health problem than a jail? If you have any problem, they're going to get worse and worse. And so if you do ever come out, it's almost certain to be worse. But again, we don't want to expand treatment because that's too soft on crime. That's too lenient. But I think absolutely that there could be any number of studies that would show that better treatment for mental health problems, better treatment for drug or alcohol addiction, we would see a significant decrease in crime.
Well, and am I not correct also in saying that that statistics have proved over the decades that higher levels of sentencing and severity of sentencing really do not have any effect on recidivism, that they don't diminish the likelihood of crimes being committed or recommitted.
Right. I think that's absolutely true. I mean, it sometimes seems counterintuitive, but I think that's really true that they don't, just because um, that the notion that criminals are sort of logical and they think if I commit a crime, I'm going to go to jail, and if they increase the penalty, well, I'm going to go to jail for longer, that that will deter people from committing crimes. Well, they're not thinking, they wouldn't do that in the first place. But yeah, we just, as I say, I think we're just stuck with this retributive model. Though I did want to say, and something I always look for hopeful stories, and I think this is a hopeful story, but maybe 3 or 4 months ago, there was a guy executed in Alabama, and he'd committed when he was I think 19 maybe. He and some other younger men had brutally murdered this woman who was hitchhiking. And this guy was not one of these who in prison became a Christian or saved or something. That his final words to the warden were a string of obscenities. And when they strapped him onto the gurney for lethal injection, he raised both of his middle fingers when they asked him if he had anything to say. But what struck me about this is that the daughter of the woman who was murdered had told the state, please do not execute this man. Whatever his attitudes, he had a horrible childhood. I mean, he sort of reenacted in this horrific murder what had been done to him, but that she was forgiving, not because he deserved it, not because he was repentant or even ever said that I'm sorry for what I did, but because she had compassion and understanding for him and was able to forgive. And just like I think you, Linda, in saying, if you hold that, we have to have resolution, we have to have closure, we have to do this, that healing will be hard to find.
Yes, and I have one more thing that you haven't mentioned, just briefly. I would say it's become a real source of concern to me that given the fact that our legislature is unable and or unwilling to pass any sort of reasonable beginning steps in regulating guns in an appropriate way or access to guns, that on a corollary basis, it seems like now we have children who are under the age of 18 who commit terrible crimes with guns they got from their parents being sentenced to prison for life without parole. I somehow, to me, it is inherently flawed to send a child to prison, an adult prison, for life without parole. I don't know what your opinion is about that is, or what you think. I feel like it's almost that it's almost an effort to placate people with these horrible sentences because of the fact that the legislature refuses to act.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can guess. I mean, I think that's a horrible thing, but I think it is a way of trying to show, see, we're doing something about crime, because because we're unwilling to really address many of the root causes, and because we're unwilling to fund the things that could really prevent more crime, we fall back on it. And I think, I don't, sorry to throw politics into this, but I think the current president thinks that by talking about how we want to have more death penalty cases, why we want to deport thousands of immigrants, it's a way of claiming that we're doing something about crime. But I think it's safe to say that nothing that he's suggested is likely to have any impact on crime except possibly raise it.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Anyway, Tom, it's great to see you.
Nice to see you. Thanks, Linda.
This point was very interesting. We haven't even begun to touch the subject of your book about the Brady Rule and the unfair advantage that prosecutors have, or at least had, in concealing favorable evidence to defendants. And we can do that maybe in another session. And I think there's a brand new deal, Jennifer, in the Crumley case, where the parents were convicted of abetting their son's murder of 4 students, and he was 15 at the time. Whole lot of issues involved in that. But anyway, we let Eduardo cool his heels. So Eduardo, tell us where you're calling from and go ahead with your offering.
I'm calling from Mexico.
Welcome.
Tom, let me tell you a little story that I have at Loma Linda. Cliff Goldstein was visiting us at a Sabbath school class. And I said, Cliff, I have a hard question, so be careful with the answer. And I remember Ivan Blyson told me, be careful with the question. So having that in mind, I recommend you to be careful with the answer. I see the Congress, the government, with this Biden and Trump pardons, that they break the pledge allegiance to the flag, especially for the last word of the pledge, justice for all. What in the mind of the congressman, the government, compared with the rest of the prisoners, consider the justice was served? Why you let these criminals out of prison and not ourselves too? This is not justice for all. What do you think? I think it's a pagan tradition. Remember when Jesus was in court, they said, oh, we have the custom of letting a prisoner go free, a criminal. So what do you think? You are muted.
Ask him to unmute again.
Tom, you are muted. So
sorry. Yeah,
thanks.
Thank you. I think when we say justice for all, we really don't think about that much. It's in the pledge, but it's just something we recite literally. I think it's aspirational. It's what we would like to see, but it's very elusive. I think man's justice is always elusive, and that the only justice that we can really rely on will be God's justice. And what we know is that his justice is filled with mercy and compassion and understanding for every person on earth, whatever they have or haven't done. So I'll leave it at that. I think we struggle to find justice in lots of ways, and we very often fail. And one thing we can try to do again, is to visit those people who are caught up in our justice system, whether they're guilty or innocent. They're God's children.